Good evening and welcome to a People for Effective Government online event. I'm PEG board member Jenny Darrell, and I will be co-moderating tonight's event with another board member, Jeff Williams. PEG is a nonprofit Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Its mission is to support approaches to governing which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've held in-person public forums and online events like this one for over 3 years. PEG works to encourage sincere and civil discussions on the challenges that face our nation and seeks to promote effective solutions to those challenges by presenting public forums on a variety of relevant topics. As a reminder, the views presented tonight by our guest speaker are his own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in political activity of any kind. Our audience is welcome to submit brief questions at any time via the Q&A feature. Please limit your questions to 2 to 3 sentences if possible. You're welcome to ask several questions, but if you could, please submit one at a time. Our speaker will answer as many questions as possible before we end the forum by 8:30. Tonight's event, as you heard, is being recorded and will be posted on our website, www.pegnow.org, within a couple of weeks. Tonight's forum topic is U.S. foreign policy in China, the future of our trade and political relationship. This forum will explore the complex relationship between the United States and China, one of our major trading partners. I'm very excited to introduce this evening's speaker. As governor of Washington State, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, and U.S. Ambassador to China, Gary Locke has been a leader in the areas of education, employment, trade, healthcare, human rights, immigration reform, privacy, and the environment. Currently, Gary Locke serves as the interim president of Bellevue College, which is the third largest higher education institution in Washington State, serving nearly 30,000 students annually. As Washington's 21st governor from 1997 to 2005, the nation's most trade-dependent state, Mr. Locke increased exports of Washington State products and services by leading trade missions to Mexico, Europe, and Asia, more than doubling the state's exports to China. As U.S. Secretary of Commerce from 2009 to 2011, he led President Obama's National Export Initiative to double American exports in 5 years, assumed a troubled 2010 census process, but which under his supervision ended on time and substantially under budget, saving taxpayers $2 billion, and achieved the most significant reduction in patent application processing in the agency's history, from 40 months down to 1 year. With U.S. Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, Secretary Locke oversaw a significant first step in the president's export control reform effort that strengthened national security while making U.S. companies more competitive by easing their licensing burden for high-tech exports. And then as U.S. Ambassador to China, from 2011 to 2014, he opened markets for made in the USA goods and services, reduced wait times for visa interviews of Chinese applicants from 100 days to 3 days, and through the embassy's air quality monitoring program, exposed the severity of air pollution in China, causing the Chinese people to demand action by the government, and the government in turn beginning to address the issue. It's obvious that Ambassador Locke brings a breadth of experience in this topic, so let's launch this discussion. Ambassador Locke, the floor is yours.
Always got to remember to unmute. Well, thank you very much, Jenny and Jeff, for inviting me to speak to the members of PEG. And I really appreciate your goals and your missions of having public discussion in a nonpartisan fashion and really helping foster understanding of the many complex issues facing our communities, our region, and our nation. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you a little bit about China. And love to leave some time open for questions that you might have. You know, some almost 50 years ago, when President Nixon first visited China, I think it would have been almost impossible to imagine just how the very simple society he encountered would so dramatically transform itself into the modern China of today. I mean, the bicycle and the hutong alleys that characterized China even 25 years ago have given way to Audis, elevated freeways, and the world's largest network of high-speed bullet trains traveling more than 100 miles per hour. Since 2008 in the Beijing Olympics, almost 16,000 miles have been built of this high-speed rail. That's enough to crisscross America more than 6 times. And yet we in America don't even have a single mile of truly high-speed rail. And of course, half of the world's tallest skyscrapers are in China, in virtually every city of China. And you know, China's society has changed beyond all recognition. And at the heart of the most sweeping social and economic transformation the world has ever seen is the rise of a powerful new and largely urban middle class. And the pace of change has just been extraordinary. As recently as the year 2000, only 4% of the Chinese urban households were middle class. And in 2 years, it's predicted that 3/4 of all urban households will be middle class, and almost 45% of the entire country, the population of the country, will be middle class. And the upper middle class, which now makes up only about 14% of the urban population, is expected in a few years to rise to almost half the urban population. There are 1 million millionaires in China and more than 600 billionaires compared to just 63 billionaires 7 years ago. There are more billionaires in China than there are in the United States. When President Nixon first went to China, the yearly bilateral two-way trade was less than $100 million a year, and two-way investment in each other's countries was close to zero, and only a handful of American jobs depended on trade with China. But today, almost $1.5 billion of goods and services flow between our two countries every single day. And China is America's largest export market outside of North America, with exports to China growing twice as fast as exports to the rest of the world. Now, when we were in the Commerce Department, we had a saying: the more American companies export, the more they produce. The more they produce, the more workers they need, and that means good paying jobs for the American people. And so two-way trade and exports, especially from the United States to China, is very, very important. America is China's largest export market, exceeding exports from China to all of the EU countries combined. And China is America's largest export destination for all of our farm goods that we don't eat and consume ourselves. So we actually export more of, for instance, our Washington agricultural products to China than to any other destination. More than 700,000 jobs in America depend on producing goods and services exported to China. And several millions of jobs in the United States depend on this two-way trade, whether it's the dock workers handling the goods coming in to the processing and the distribution and the trucking of products to the Home Depots, to the Targets, to the Walmarts, or to the Nordstroms. With the success that the Chinese have achieved, companies are going global and they're investing abroad. The value of yearly Chinese investments to the United States soared from virtually zero in the year 2000 to 46 billion in 2016, although they have dropped dramatically in the last several years due to some of our more restrictive US policies. And the investments in the United States by Chinese companies run the gamut from high-tech, shale gas, manufacturing, entertainment, food processing to real estate. And these Chinese companies operating in America employ some 140,000 Americans. And many of these Chinese companies rescued bankrupt US companies, certainly during the 2008 recession and the shuttering of so many companies in Detroit associated with the automobile manufacturing sector. The Chinese came in and actually rescued many of those and turned those around and ended up hiring even more Americans than the companies had before. So measured against the past, our two sides have made enormous progress, and people on both sides of the Pacific have benefited from this deepening economic integration. But it's against this backdrop of China's dramatic social and economic transformation that the United States and China find themselves in a very intractable and very bitter trade war. Let me just say that in a trade war, there are no winners, only losers on both sides: the businesses, the workers, and most of all, the consumers. Now, America and other foreign companies and governments have real issues, very legitimate and real issues with the industrial and the economic policies of China that China has used to get ahead, that they have used to get ahead. Discrimination, unfair treatment against foreign companies, sectors of the Chinese economy that are actually closed off limits to foreign investment. Whereas in the United States, virtually any company from any part of the world can, enter into the oil and gas sector or into the financial services sector, into high technology, and the list goes on and on. But not so in China. Many sectors are absolutely off limits to any type of foreign participation, foreign investment, even as a minority owner. Some of the issues that we have with China include weak protections for intellectual property, forced technology transfer, so that, for instance, a US company that is allowed to do business in China, they can only be, let's say, less than a 50% partner. And so when they have a joint venture, a partnership with a Chinese company, oftentimes in order to do that business, the US company, the foreign company, has to share their technology, their trade secrets with that Chinese partner. And then after a few years, 5-6 years, when the agreement runs out, well, the Chinese company now has all the know-how and the knowledge and the sophistication to basically go off on their own. They won't need that US partner. And so it's that forced transfer of technology in order to do business in China that riles many foreign companies. And then, of course, our big complaint is that the government subsidizes a lot of these enterprises and companies and advanced industries, which makes it unfair competition for foreign companies. And then, of course, our big concern is with government-sponsored cyber theft, hacking of US companies, and they're getting access to their technology and their trade secrets. But as much as we have these issues and concerns with China's trade and economic policies, one simply has to question whether the tariffs, across the board tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States imposed by the Trump administration is really the best way to address America's concerns. Because when we impose tariffs anywhere from 15 to 30% on the Chinese goods coming in, that's an extra tax imposed on the value of the goods coming into the United States from China, which is then paid for by the company that ordered the product, let's say a US manufacturing facility or a Target or a Walmart. That is then passed on to the ultimate consumer or the customer. And to no surprise, when the United States imposed these tariffs on virtually all Chinese goods coming into America, China imposed tariffs on US goods going into China. But in this scenario of dueling tariffs, American companies, American workers, and American consumers are being hurt. Because, like I said, the tariffs are not being paid for by China. They're paid for by the American business and the American consumer. In fact, the New York Fed and the Wall Street Journal estimated that the cost of the tariffs on the average American household was about $6 to $800 extra per year. And certainly in a time of rising prices and high inflation, many people have been urging the Biden administration to reduce or eliminate these tariffs so that prices could go down. And what's really exacerbating or galling is the fact that so much of what America buys every day, what our consumers buy, is made in China, with very few substitutes available at comparable prices. On the other hand, Chinese tariffs on American goods entering China may not equally hurt Chinese companies and their consumers. Because, for instance, most of the things that you buy at Walmart are made in China. Most of the shoes you buy at Nordstrom or Walmart or Target or any other place are made in China. So what substitutes do you have unless you buy very expensive European shoes? The Chinese, on the other hand, have a lot of substitutes and available to them. They don't have to buy American soybeans. They can buy soybeans in Brazil. They don't have to buy Boeing airplanes. They can buy Airbus. They don't have to buy an MRI or an X-ray machine made by GE. They can buy it from Philips, made in Germany, and the list goes on, or Siemens, and the list goes on and on. So the Chinese have more options to get around the tariffs that have been imposed on American goods, and that benefits American competitors, whether in Germany, Canada, Brazil, or elsewhere. Even people from President Bush's administration have said that while we have legitimate concerns about the trade and economic policies of China, going it alone, having America and only America impose tariffs on Chinese goods benefited our competitors and the countries around the world. While they were rooting for us to succeed in hoping that we could convince China and force China to change its trade and economic policies, in the meantime, their companies were benefiting by getting increased business because the Chinese were avoiding American products. Let me also say that in this tough economic times and with the tensions between China and the United States, and certainly as the pandemic demonstrated, we are too reliant, quite frankly, on products made from China. The disruption in the supply chain because of the pandemic, when so many companies in China shut down, we were left without a reliable supply of goods. And certainly during the height of the pandemic, when we needed protective gear, so much of that was made in China. So there's a realization all around the world that companies and countries need to diversify their supply of critical components, whether it's in manufacturing or even for healthcare. And China is also realizing that as well, because they are so dependent on many high-tech goods made in America or made by American companies. During the Trump administration, the president was proposing to ban U.S. companies or forbid U.S. companies from selling high-tech equipment to a company called ZTE. And that was because they violated the terms of their probation that had been imposed during the Obama administration, dealing with the improper sales. I think it was to either Iran or to North Korea. And so they did not abide by the terms of their probation. And so President Trump came out with an order that said that no U.S. company could sell ZTE any type of materials. Well, ZTE makes telecommunications gear, but they also make very low cost, inexpensive, simple cell phones that are very popular because of the low price all around the world. Well, they get the glass on our cell phones from Corning. Corning makes a very unique glass called Gorilla Glass that's on virtually every cell phone that people have. Well, if they did not have access to Corning's Gorilla Glass, it would have bankrupted ZTE. President Trump ultimately relented and allowed ZTE to continue to purchase American high-tech goods, components for their cell phones. But what was the message to the Chinese leaders? Wow, we better not be so dependent on goods from America. We need to really become self-sufficient. And so they have doubled down on their program and their policy called Made in China 2025, where they want to be leading, where they want to be world-class leaders in telecommunications gear, in robotics, artificial intelligence, electric automobiles, in biotechnology, and even manufacturing of chip semiconductors, simply because they do not want to possibly be held hostage to the policies, the foreign policies of America, whether under a Democrat or Republican administration, that they needed to be independent. Just as we have realized that we really need to be more independent and having diversified supplies from around the world, or even manufacturing much of that here at home. Because even now with the pandemic, when many US companies diversified their supply to get articles, let's say from Southeast Asia, Vietnam or Thailand, what happened is that during this pandemic, a lot of those factories were shut down in Vietnam and elsewhere because they did not have the coronavirus under control. So what have a lot of American companies done? They've shifted back to China for the manufacturing of shoes and clothes and sporting goods, et cetera, et cetera. So we have simply got to make sure that we have a very diversified supply chain and that we are protected, especially with respect to critical components, whether it be in high technology, telecommunications, or medical equipment and medical supplies. But let me just say that given the tension between China and the United States, and certainly we have concerns about China's military efforts, their claim of territory in the South China Sea, their claim over islands, disputed islands that include, the islands that are disputed by Philippines and Vietnam. They're building huge military bases out of small little islands by dredging sand and expanding the size of those islands and putting air bases on them. And then flying very, very close, if not over the defense zones of Taiwan. There's a lot of concern by American policyholders and members of the military that all it takes is an inadvertent, unintentional stare down between American pilots or American and Chinese pilots and American and Chinese naval officers that could lead to a unintended conflict, a downing of an airplane, a bumping of an airplane in which an airplane has to land or is damaged and lives are lost. So things could simply get out of control and could lead to a huge escalation of military action. And certainly that needs to be avoided at all costs. But in this growing tension, American policymakers, including members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, are going after and basically saying that purchasing of materials by government agencies like a transit agency, a subway agency in New York, California, Seattle, Boston, that they are not allowed to buy anything made by a Chinese company, even if it's assembled here in the United States with union workers, and even if all the components come from Europe, because it is technically owned by a company in China that is somehow suspect. And even companies here in the United States in Silicon Valley that have been founded by Chinese Americans who were born in the United States, who don't even speak Chinese, that there's somehow the products from those companies must be suspect. So while we have legitimate concerns about the trade and economic policies of China and their military actions and their record on human rights, I think it's very, very important that we differentiate our concerns for the policies of China, the government of China, from the people of China, and certainly Chinese Americans here in the United States. I mean, my father, while he was born in China, came over at the age of 12, learned English here, joined the United States Army about 6 months before the outbreak of World War II, was in the 5th Armored Division and was part of the Normandy invasion and the race to Berlin under secret orders from General Patton to try to beat the Russians to Berlin. And so my dad's unit, and like so many other of those who fought in northern France and into Germany, encountered some of the most stiffest resistance by the Germans as they made their last stand to protect Germany, and to kind of hold off the Allied forces. So, Chinese Americans have given their blood, sweat, and tears for this country, with so many Nobel Prize winners of Chinese ancestry, who have founded great companies here in the United States and have been contributing to the vitality and the innovation and the dynamism of America. So let's try to make sure that whatever policies and arguments we have with the government of China, that we don't take it out on Chinese Americans. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of violence against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans over the last year because of the coronavirus and because of the tensions between China and the United States. Just a huge increase in violence against Chinese Americans, where people say, go back where you're from, even though the person was actually born in the United States and may not even speak Chinese. And a lot of these assaults have been captured on video, street cameras, people attacking Chinese elderly, Chinese women, and it's very, very sad. And I appreciate that Republican and Democratic leaders have stood up to say, this is wrong, this is not what America is all about. But we need to keep that in mind and understand that we are a nation of foreigners, of immigrants, whether we're first generation or 10th generation. Except for the Native Americans, we're all foreigners. Whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower, on a slave vessel from Africa, or on a steamer from China. And it's been that constant infusion, wave after wave, of people coming to America over the last several hundred years with different languages and cultures and ideas, customs, foods, designs and fashions that have really made America the innovative, dynamic country that it is, the most innovative, the most powerful economy in the world today. So with that, I'm just going to stop and entertain any questions that you might have on just about any topic.
Okay, thank you very much. Still having a hard time here. Okay, there. We all have a hard time once in a while.
It is hard to get used to this, isn't it?
So yes, even though we've been doing it for what, a year and a half. So we have some questions starting, but I'd kind of like to start the questions off with asking you about your experience, what your experience was growing up as an American of Chinese ancestry, and how that helped your role as ambassador.
Well, to be quite honest, I was very conflicted growing up, watching a lot of these television shows that I had. It shows my age, but watching shows like Father Knows Best and the Donna Reed Show, or My Three Sons and things like that, and the moms in those shows, whether it was Leave It to Beaver or the Donna Reed Show, the moms were vacuuming their floors in high heels, in dresses, and pearl necklaces. And so I kind of gave my mom grief and saying, how come you're not like that, and why can't you be American like the moms on our American TV shows? So I was pretty rebellious and it gave my parents a lot of grief, and for that I am just so regretful and ashamed of that. But we grew up, using chopsticks and everything, and eating Chinese foods. So part of the Chinese culture, as much as I was conflicted, was a real part of me. And I really think that we focused on a lot of traditional Asian values of focusing on education, working hard, and simply taking care of each other. And I remember my dad and mom always having visitors coming to the house and staying with us for a month or two, and sometimes relatives and their whole families, when they came from China or Hong Kong, staying with us in the basement for 8 to 9 months until they got settled. Dad was always, finding furniture and donating it to immigrant families. And mom and dad were always sending money back to the village. And I never really understood why, until at the end of my first year as governor, we made a trade mission to Japan and China. And at the very end of that trade mission, mom and dad and my brothers and sisters all met me in Hong Kong. And we went back to the family village where mom and dad were married almost exactly 50 years before, and they had not set foot in China or the family village since their wedding 50 years before. And it was just an outpouring of emotions as we were going up the river to this very small city in rural China, southern China, which was really the source of most of the immigration from China to the United States in the 1800s and all the way up to about 1950. A very poor part of the country of China, which is why they wanted to leave to come to America to work on to finish the railroad, to work in the gold mines, the lumber camps, and so forth. But what was interesting is that this village, family village, was literally 2 miles from a city of millions and millions of people, a very modern city. And yet, when we stepped into the family village, it was like stepping back into the 1800s when my grandfather first came to the United States. And they had no running water. They had outhouse at the outskirts of the village. People washed washed clothes by hand, obviously no toilets. And they cooked using wood kindling and coal briquettes in the back of the house. One bare light bulb hanging from each room. Not every room had actual glass in the windows to let the light in. And refrigerators were the size of what you might see in a hotel room or a college dorm, which is why there's so much spoilage of food in the countryside, where 40% of the population live. And so I could understand now why mom and dad were always sending money back to the village, because it was the people in the village years ago, and it's the custom of people in the village to pool their money to help send a villager to America or to another country. And so this was mom and dad's way of trying to acknowledge the contributions and the sacrifices of members of the village that enabled the Locke clan to be successful. So I came away realizing that my success in America as an individual and as governor was enabled by the contributions of the people in the village. And so that made me very, very thankful. Let me just say that as governor, I tried to remember my immigrant experience and roots, and trying to be sensitive to the issues that immigrants face, whether it's making sure that they understand what's happening in a court proceeding, they understand the consequences of pleading guilty to even a minor crime, that could be grounds for deportation, to making sure that we have food stamps available for non-US citizens. I mean, for instance, at one point during my tenure as governor, the United States Congress ended food stamps for non-US citizens. And I said, whoa, why are we doing that? Because I know a lot of people who are Canadian citizens who have lived here in the United States, who have kept their Canadian citizenship, but paying US taxes as nurses and doctors and lawyers and so forth. But they're now elderly, and if they're of modest income, wow, they're not eligible for food stamps, even though they've been paying taxes to the United States government and state taxes all their lives. Why should they be discriminated against because they're an immigrant, because they never bothered to become a US citizen? So I really tried to use that awareness of the immigrant experience and a recognition that down deep we're all immigrants, whether we're first generation or 10th generation, whether our ancestors came from Poland, Ireland, Germany, Great Britain, Mexico, Portugal, Brazil, or China, or Japan, or Korea, that I try to use those experiences and sensitivity in looking at all the laws that we passed and making sure that they were really, really fair.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, do you have some questions from the audience?
Yeah, I do. So we're getting a little, the meaty bits here. So and I'm quoting the question, for most of the 1990s, it was assumed that the carrot of trade with China would lead to democratization and acceptance, to some degree, of a rules-based system by China. Do you consider that to be a success? Part one, should we continue along this path? Why or why not?
I think there were greater hopes that trade by China with other countries and with China would help open up China and lead to more democratization and modernization of China. Certainly the modernization has occurred. because when China is able to sell its made in China goods around the world, that created jobs for the Chinese people, moved them off of the farm, off of an agrarian agricultural society to a manufacturing society, even though it might have been low wage. But for them, it was a huge boost in income. And that really helped fuel the modernization of China, in which hundreds and hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in just a very short few decades. Like I said, it is the most dramatic transformation the world has ever seen. But certainly, I think we had high hopes and expectations, and they have not been met. And China, at least in the last few years, have perhaps gone backwards or have really become even more closed and more resistant to openness, and certainly has not really kept its promises that it made when it joined the WTO, which enabled it to have these open markets, and certainly the expectations and promises it made to the United States over the last several years have not been kept. So it is of great concern. Now, whether or not we can actually go backwards, I don't think we can. I don't think we can. Even if we don't sell very much stuff to China anymore, China is able to sell to other countries around the world who still need their products and their services. And in fact, China is engaging in huge diplomatic efforts the way America used to, when we used to give out lots of foreign aid to developing countries to help build hospitals and roads and clean water systems, where we used to help them, bring electricity to their rural areas, and the list goes on and on. We have stopped doing that. We do very little of that. China, however, has stepped into the gap, and therefore is creating political allies that we could really use in times of a crisis. Even your military generals have been urging the Congress to give the US State Department more money to engage in foreign aid and assistance to help improve and elevate the image of America around the world. Because in that vacuum, China is stepping in. China, though, is such a huge economy that it cannot be ignored. And what China is saying is that a lot of these rules of the trading system were made before, without China, without India, without Brazil. And these are the concerns and complaints by what they call the BRIC countries, Brazil and India, Russia, and China, that they are such huge parts of the world economy, and yet they're having to live by rules that they never had a hand in setting. So I think obviously we need to bring everybody at the table, and we need to have a consensus and a compromise, but we also need to really enforce them. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of the WTO. The enforcement mechanisms are not very strong when it comes to violations done by countries like China.
Thank you.
Okay. What are China's goals regarding the United States, particularly regarding the big issues of economics, defense, cybersecurity, intellectual property, technologic capability?
They want to be world class. They want to be world class, and they're doing anything and everything they can to try to catch up to the West, and especially the United States. They're trying to learn from the United States as much as possible. For instance, their court system, as much as we want them to improve their intellectual property protections, they are actually starting to model their courts after the United States with Court of Appeals, because in the old days, or in the past, you had all these courts scattered throughout the country, and there was no consistency in some of the court decisions coming out with respect to intellectual property enforcement. So now they actually have a centralized court that handles intellectual property the same way that the United States does. We now have a special court in Washington, D.C. that really oversees so many of these intellectual property cases. China has benefited from having exchanges with legal scholars and judges from America who have really are concerned about trying to improve the legal system of China. And so they've been having these exchanges and trying to educate and demonstrate to and propose modifications to the Chinese legal system. And the Chinese have been really following that to some degree. Still, the judicial system is still pretty weak there because many of the judges are not trained lawyers. And they are still controlled in many cases by the government, whether it's the state, the local government, or the national government. And there needs to be independence within the judiciary, between the judiciary and the other branches of government. But China is starting to make progress in a lot of these areas, and even U.S. companies that are suing Chinese companies for copyright infringement, for like Starbucks, copycat Starbucks with the logos and things like that. U.S. companies, Starbucks, have been winning their lawsuits against these Chinese companies and forcing them to shut down. So there is progress, but of course we think that it should be much faster. But let me just say that the Chinese want to move ahead. They want to be on par with U.S. companies. And that's why the Chinese government is protective of many of their industries, hoping that they can have that cushion, that head start, that protection, so they can grow and become more sophisticated before they allow competition with the West. And of course, there's also the problem of government-sponsored hacking, cyber theft of technology and trade secrets, and that has to be stopped. We also have that same problem with Russia. But in Russia, a lot of that is by criminal elements who are protected, so to speak, by the Russian government. In China, we're seeing cyber theft by units of the Chinese government, especially the military units. And so, all forms of that type of cyber theft need to be halted. Thank
you. Jeff?
Yeah, another question from the audience. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit. We've witnessed very significant human rights abuses in China, from Hong Kong to the Uyghurs. We have seen things we didn't think we'd see. These are, significant abuses, and yet we still trade with them, right? And we still engage, and we probably should. But the question is, fundamentally, how do we reconcile these egregious abuses with continuing to face the reality of doing business with them? And it's a tough thing to do, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it's a really tough issue, and I'm pleased that the Biden administration is raising these issues, and under even President Trump, and continued with President Biden, and President Biden who's speaking out even more on this. We've imposed sanctions against companies that actually do business or emanating use forced labor in the areas of where the Uyghurs live, or even involving Tibetans. And we're trying to impose sanctions on the governments associated with some of the crackdown in Hong Kong. But we have to be realistic. That's a very limited power or effectiveness. But at least we need to stand up and state our principles and what our values are and our concerns, as opposed to being silent and not doing anything about it. Now, how effective that will be is certainly debatable. And some people say we need to be even more aggressive and more confrontational. But it's a tough call. And certainly you have American companies that are able to do what they want, and they have to balance, their obligations to their shareholders and to their employees here in America who rely on that trade with China against their values on all of these contentious issues, whether it's human rights dealing with the Uyghurs, the lack of independence or the less independence of Hong Kong, to the treatment of journalists and lawyers and activists. But we face that same dilemma with other countries. Take Russia, for example. We're very concerned about Russia possibly invading the Ukraine. How far are we willing to go if they do? How far are we willing to go with sanctions if they do invade the Ukraine? It's been said that, Europe, our allies, don't want us to come down too hard on Russia because they're depending on natural gas coming from Russia to supply Europe. And with the winter months and with inflation so high and the cost of other fuel, oil and gas around the world much higher than it was years ago, that would make life very, very difficult for the Europeans. If we really wanted to go after Russia, well, maybe they would stop selling us titanium. Russia is one of America's largest suppliers of titanium, which we use in Boeing aircraft and all of our military aircraft. Where do we draw the line? And I don't profess to have an answer. I don't profess to have an answer to some of these very, very tough, intractable issues. We also need the cooperation of China to fight climate change. The United States produces more greenhouse gases than any, we produce more greenhouse gases per person than any other country in the world. China produces more greenhouse gases, period, because they have 4 times the population of America. If China were to move aggressively, as they are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but America does very little, then all of the efforts in China will be for naught, and vice versa. If we make substantial progress in reducing carbon emissions, but China continues to build coal-powered electrical plants to provide electricity to the impoverished parts of China, then all of our efforts will be for naught. So we need to be working in concert, in collaboration with China, and that's what the world is expecting. They want both China and the United States to make real progress together in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Otherwise, all the efforts in Europe and the other parts of the world will be for naught. We need to be working with China in terms of halting the proliferation and the development of nuclear weapons in North Korea. And China is a key player. And the same thing in terms of trying to get the Iranians to honor the nuclear arms deal and the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. China is a key player in that. So how do we draw the line? How do we cooperate on things that are of vital interest to the world and to America, and at the same time indicate our values and uphold our values and not simply turn our backs to the things that we profess to be near and dear to what America is all about? I don't have an easy answer. There are no easy answers to that.
Right. Thank you. No, we appreciate it. Ginny, you're next.
Okay. You talked a little bit about Chinese investments in other countries, including the United States, and assisting companies that were failing and keeping Americans employed. They've also, well, they've underwritten some debt, and they've invested in infrastructure here. Are there risks in that to the United States?
I don't think there are risks to their investments in infrastructure. It depends on how they've made those investments. Obviously, they've made some investments in other countries in which there were very, very bad deals for the people of those other countries. For instance, developing ports, really, which were not economically viable. These projects were not, a good business deal for anyone. And then when the project basically goes belly up because of lack of customers and therefore an inability to pay off the debt to the Chinese entity then took ownership of it. Well, no country should allow that. And so certainly the investment that the Chinese have made in America have not been to own infrastructure. They may have contributed and help pay for the bonds or buy the bonds behind the project. But they have certainly no ownership in things like the 520 bridge here in Seattle, or a highway, or a port. They may be allowed to operate ports, but the ownership has to stay. I think any wise government would say you need to keep the ownership in your own, with your own government. And that is why I think some countries around the world are beginning to take a second look at some of these investment deals that they've entered into with China. Some have pulled out. And the United States has certainly been cautioning these countries to really take a hard look at whether or not the debt the investment can be repaid, what is the form of ownership or collateral, what happens in a default, et cetera, et cetera. But that also means the United States and the Western countries need to step up and provide investment opportunities and loans and foreign assistance to these countries that are so desperate to develop, to modernize, that sometimes they feel they have no choice but to agree to the terms put forth by the Chinese, and that's unfortunate. But the other investments here are private sector. Anything that in America that touches upon national security has to be approved by the U.S. government. And the United States government under Democratic and Republican administrations have nullified or voided some of these deals, even after the fact, even after they've closed, and have forced the participating companies to unravel the deal. Other deals have been modified to make sure that, let's say, a Chinese company wants to buy an aircraft, a small aircraft manufacturer along the lines of a Cessna or, that type of small aircraft. And if part of that American company supplies anything to the military, then that part of the business is split off and cannot be owned in any way by a Chinese company, so that it's, there's absolutely no threat to national security, no possibility that the Chinese company can take ownership, control, understand the technology involving the products that go to the military. And so sometimes they have to split the company in two, and the Chinese company can buy the Cessna type operation, and then the part of the company that supplies the military is given to another company that meets U.S. approval, let's say another U.S. company.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Question about Xi. And this goes back to Deng Xiaoping. And one of the things Deng Xiaoping seemed to believe in or say was hide your strength, right? And maybe that he was channeling Sun Tzu, but it seems like this is a common attribute or behavior of Chinese negotiators: hide your strength. And Xi seems to have said, "All right, enough of that, right? We're not going to really hide it anymore. We're going to be aggressive, and we're going to throw our weight around." And to me, there must have been some threshold met for him to decide that. I'm assuming that. And do you see that there is an actual threshold that has been met, or do you just perceive it as Xi said, "I'm in charge now, I'm going to do it my way"? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think all the Chinese leaders over time have been in some ways biding their time, and they're not willing to. They've been reluctant to really be more forceful while they were still trying to develop as a country. But now China is feeling its strength and is very proud of its accomplishments, and that has really motivated so much of their policies of the past. They really feel that they have been humiliated over the last several centuries by the West, in which the West, like during the Opium War, took control of China and carved out different parts of the country and even different parts of the city, and allowed foreign countries to actually run and control various parts of those cities. For instance, in Shanghai, there was the part that was owned and controlled by the Americans, by the British, the French, the Germans, et cetera, et cetera. And they really felt great shame by that. They also were shamed by some of the policies of the Chinese emperors, who did not embrace industrialization the way that Japan did. And so they saw their society really stagnate. And then, of course, the wars and the occupations, invasions by Japan, and so forth. So they really have felt, as Henry Kissinger said, they're really trying to overcome several centuries of shame. And so they've been in a race to catch up, to reassert themselves, because they've long viewed themselves as the Middle Kingdom, in which the world really revolved around China as the most advanced society in the world. And China was really the most advanced country in the world several centuries ago. Now, several centuries ago, but America and the West have certainly eclipsed China. So China is doing everything it can to really try to restore their aura in the world, to have that pride, which is why they really wanted the Beijing Olympics as a showcase to show the world, look how far we've come, which is why they are so active in space, to put a man on the moon, to send people around the earth, to really show their coming of age, their sophistication, their technological prowess. So I think given the incredible transformation of China, they now feel that they do not need to simply listen to the United States. I mean, there was a time in which there was kind of a saying in which people said that the Chinese people, if an American person said, this is how you should do it, they would do it exactly that way, because they just said, wow, the Americans know how to do it, and they're the best. And then later on, they said, well, yeah, maybe not. You know, we're going to learn what was good and bad in America. And now sometimes they openly say, hey, if that's how America does it, we're doing it the opposite way. Because they've actually seen some of our failings, like our response to Hurricane Katrina, and how we botched that. You know, how our education system is not churning out engineers and people in high technology, and the list goes on and on. Certainly, the collapse of the financial system in 2008, and yet China was able to ride that out pretty well because of their own policies. So they're now beginning to say, well, maybe our policies are better, and the Western ideas and the Western policies may not be all that it's cracked up to be. So I think that because of all these of their growing strength, their growing confidence, their growing accomplishments, the growing modernization of their country, and what they see happening in the weaknesses of the West, whether it's in finances or response to natural disasters and things like that, they're saying, well, maybe the United States model and the Western model is not all that it is cracked up to be. And so they're feeling they can go a lot more, take a more independent path, and they're proud. I mean, they got so much money. They're giving out all this foreign aid. They're being very open about their pride.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
Wondering what your thoughts are on the movement to allow immigrants in the country to be able to vote without completing the citizenship requirements.
Well, that's up to every individual jurisdiction. You know, whether it's a school board election or a city council race. I mean, I think that has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. I mean, that's an issue for each community to decide on its own. Certainly with respect to national elections, I mean, our Constitution is pretty clear. Our federal laws are pretty clear. So, you know, I don't support allowing people to vote in our national races if they're not a U.S. citizen.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Next question. Taiwan obviously looms large. I would ask, do you think a invasion of Taiwan is around the corner? Probably not, but want to hear your opinion. Then the follow-up to that would be, what conditions do you think would need to exist to make that more likely?
Well, it's a topic of great concern to all of our military officials throughout Asia and certainly in the United States, because all it takes is, you know, let's say an airplane, a jet from either side, you know, coming too close and clipping wings, and then plane crashes and a pilot, several people die, and then does that unleash, you know, the response of the other side, and where does it lead? Artillery shells, and then guided missiles, and then possibly nuclear weapons. I mean, it's, you know, once there's a confrontation, how do you stop it from one-upping and the other side trying to dominate and get the last shot, or make the last military statement? And I think that people all around the world are very, very concerned about it, because certainly the incursions by the Chinese aircraft and naval ships and everything else are getting very, very close and encroaching on air defense zones and so forth. It would be utterly disastrous to Taiwan and to the mainland. Now, obviously, mainland has more missiles and firepower than all of Taiwan, but Taiwan can unleash their missiles, and it's only like 50 miles away, separating Taiwan and the mainland. So those missiles, that amount of firepower that China has, could decimate Taiwan, completely decimate Taiwan, and bring forth huge casualties, hundreds of thousands of people dying, tens of thousands of people dying, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people injured, depending on how far Beijing would go. So what's the point? Yeah, you want to reunify the country, but you've just taken over a territory that's been completely decimated, and with no industry, and people without, food and sustenance and water and electricity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's something that has to be avoided at all costs. And let's just hope that, while there's a lot of blustering, that people recognize the limits.
Right. Thank you. Ginny?
Yeah. How does China's quality of life measure in terms of maternal and infant mortality rates, healthcare access, and sense of self-determination, satisfaction, and contentment with society and life?
Well, it really depends on which segment of the society you're talking about. If you're talking about people in the cities, it's fairly content. And a lot of the young people there, all they can, you walk down the street and they have the most, modern and sophisticated fashions and colorful fashions, perhaps even more than the United States. And everybody's on, on their, iPods and everything else, and listening to music. And you would think that the teenagers and young people in the United States or in any other modern city in the world, they're not really focused on politics. They're not focused on foreign relations. There's great pride in what they've been able to achieve as a country. But there's an undercurrent of discontent. There's an undercurrent of poverty. Like I said, about 40% of the country, of the people live in the countryside, where you're almost going back to the villages of the 1800s. There's a huge disparity of income between the cities and the countryside. While maternal health care is fairly good in China, they have a national health care system, but it covers, the problem is that it's very thin. It offers basic medical services, but not very comprehensive medical services. And that's why they're trying to copy the American system, trying to bring hospital administrators from America to help them design their healthcare system. They're trying to take the best of American healthcare system and not 100% American healthcare, given the huge inefficiencies and the cost of our system. But hospital management and safety measures and so forth, equipment. I mean, they just love anything and everything in terms of American medical technology. But there's also, you need to understand Chinese society a little bit, just how controlling it is. Here in the United States, if you're in Spokane and you want to say, hey, I want to move to Atlanta, Georgia, or I want to go to South Carolina and go work at the Boeing plant in South Carolina, you can just pack up and go and get a home or apartment and move your family and enroll in the public schools. And if you need medical care, you go to the local hospitals there, right? You can't do that in China. If you're born, let's say, in the equivalent of a Spokane in one of the provinces of China, and you're not allowed technically to move to Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou, used to be called Canton. If you do, your kids cannot enroll in the local public schools. And if you get sick, you're actually not entitled to health care at the local hospitals in that community. all of your benefits reside back in your hometown. And you have to have permission. You have to apply and get permission to relocate and live in another city. If you're a college graduate and pretty educated and have very sophisticated skills, you're probably able to do that. But if you're just a laborer, if you're a cook, if you're going to be an attendant in a hotel cleaning the rooms, you're not going to get that permission. And so you have this undercurrent, almost a different class of people, which is called the migrant class. And these are the cooks. These are the people who work in massage parlors, who work in the restaurants, who work in the hotels, and in the construction industry. These and some of the small little shopkeepers or employees of shops. These are the migrants who get no benefits, it's a second class. It's almost like a second class citizen in China. They're trying to change that policy, but it's going to be very, very difficult. Which is how they're able to prevent an influx of people flooding the cities and creating large numbers of homelessness. That's how they control the population, making sure that the people in the countryside stay in the countryside, people in the small towns and villages and the cities stay in that particular city, instead of all rushing to, let's say, Beijing or Shanghai, where it's very prosperous, and then you have you double the population, but there are no jobs for the population. So that's how they really try to maintain stability and control and avoid huge amounts of unemployment or homelessness in many of these cities.
Is there a lot of angst amongst that class, the migrant
Yes,
class?
I wouldn't say angst, it's kind of a resignation.
Oh.
A resignation. They openly chose to move into the city and to have 10 people living in an apartment because they're not entitled to government housing and they can't qualify to rent an apartment or to buy a home. And so they somehow find someone who is allowed, who has that authorized housing, and they all crash basically. And it could be a relative, it could be a friend, and they just it's really tightly very, very overcrowded conditions.
Thank you. Jeff?
Fairly recently, Russia seems to have struck up more of a relationship with China. Historically, they've seemed to be at odds, but there's this new sort of working together attitude. And the question comes to mind, it seems very transactional. So the question comes to mind, how sustainable is it?
Yeah, it is very transactional. It's trade of natural resources, power. Electrical power, gas, supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very, very transactional. But they also do have some sort of, cooperation that carries over from the Cold War days, in which it was China and Russia against the West. And so whether it's dealing with, UN votes on Syria or Iran, China and Russia still oftentimes are aligned with each other and opposing the West.
Right. Thank you. Jenny?
Okay. One of our audience members raised the question of pharmaceuticals coming from China. I'm assuming that's quality issues. I'm not sure. But the U.S.
America gets a lot of the basic pharmaceutical ingredients from China.
Okay.
We really don't get medicine from China. China is a very large producer of the component chemicals that are used in the manufacturing of medicine. And of course, a lot of the medicines are actually the generic medicines are actually coming from India and using supplies coming from China. And the same thing with American manufacturers. A lot of the I can't remember the technical name for it, but a lot of those, ingredients come from China. And then, of course, the American manufacturers need to inspect it and make sure that they meet quality standards in the final product. And there's a lot of testing involved. There is, however, an illegal entry of illegal drugs that are part of the drug epidemic in the United States, whether it's methamphetamines and fentanyl and some of these other things that America is very, very concerned about, and pushing the Chinese to curb the exports of those and the distribution of those compounds that are heart and soul, or part and parcel of the drug trade, the illegal drug trade in America.
Okay, thank you. Yours, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm picking from a list here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions we could be asking. It's a big subject. So what do you think are the pitfalls of China underwriting more and more of U.S. government debt?
I really don't think we need to worry that much about it because, quite frankly, while China may be the largest holder among foreign countries or foreign entities holding U.S. debt, the majority of U.S. debt is still held by American entities. So it's not like China or Chinese interests have the majority of U.S. debt. They have the majority or they have the most among those of the debt held by foreign entities. But it still makes up less than 50%, I mean, a very small percentage of the overall debt that's been issued by the United States. I think,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. That was like a little political game that was played a decade or so ago that, oh my God, we're in debt to China, but it turns out it's
no, obviously if China were to sell off that debt, that would affect the value of the US dollar, et cetera, but that would also then hurt China. So,
right.
If you talk to a lot of economists, they say, China may want to slowly deleverage or reduce its holdings of US debt, but it would never want to do that out of its own economic self-interest, do it massively and abruptly.
Right. Makes perfect sense. Jenny?
Okay. We have a question asking if you would favor the United States subsidizing mining, refining, and recycling of rare earth elements in order to reduce our dependence on China.
Well, I think, I'm not an expert in that area, but I've long been saying that we need to develop independent supplies of these rare earths. We have many facilities in the United States have stopped producing because of the high cost, and they can't compete with the prices charged by China. And of course, there have been articles recently about China's purchasing of rare earth mining facilities and sites in Africa, and how the United States, under both the Trump and the Obama administration, allowed those to go on, and we did not try to purchase those or assist American companies in purchasing those. I think one, in fact, was actually owned by a U.S. company or a European company that was under financial difficulty, and we did nothing to help them maintain those assets. And so they were ultimately sold to a Chinese company. And so the Chinese company, I think it's a Chinese, a government-owned entity or a government-subsidized entity, a state-owned enterprise that purchased those assets. That has to be obviously very, very concerning to our national security, because again, just as we threatened a Chinese company with no access to Corning glass, which would have bankrupted that company, so could the Chinese owner of some of these facilities if they were to say, nope, we're not going to sell you the rare earths that you need for your, electric automobiles, et cetera, or we're going to raise the prices. Now, when China got into a tiff with Japan over some territory, it raised the prices of its rare earths. And so, I mean, because they control the market so much, they were able to, exact a price on people who disagreed with China. So we need to come up with policies, again, diversifying our supply, especially in critical supplies and components, whether it's medical to rare earths to sophisticated technology. How we do that, I have not followed the debate close enough.
Jeff?
When China was your portfolio, what was the biggest challenge you felt you had with dealing with Chinese leadership?
Well, I think it's a frustration that all diplomats face, not just in China, but all around the world. We're trying to advocate on behalf of American interests. Obviously, we need to protect American citizens if they get sick and they need transport out of the country. How do we help them? If an American dies in China, how do we help the family bring the body back to the United States? If a person's arrested for a crime, how do we make sure that their rights are upheld and they're treated humanely and they have access to lawyers and communication? And that would be true whether that's an American citizen in Beijing or France or Russia or in Brazil. Those are basic American services that embassies and consulates provide for American citizens. And then trying to help open doors for American companies so that they can sell their made in USA goods and services, which we know then leads to higher employment in America. But in terms of trade, how do we make sure that the rules of the country are being followed and that they're applied equally as the law might state to both their native companies as well as foreign companies? And certainly in China, we were always running into situations where, let's say, FedEx or UPS has an application before an agency to enable it to sell or deliver services and packages out in the countryside. Because when they were first brought in, when they first entered into China, they were given a license to operate in a certain territory and told that eventually they'd be allowed to grow and expand and deliver into the remote parts of China. And so they'd have an application. They've been waiting for 2 years. And so we go to the agency and we say, hey, they've been waiting 2 years and their competitors, their Chinese competitors, are getting their licenses and applications granted in 2, 3, 4 months. And the Chinese official will say, oh, we do not discriminate. We will treat everyone fairly and equally in accordance with the law. A year later, we're back to that same agency and saying, hey, what gives? Why are American companies being discriminated against? We will follow the law and we will, abide by all our processes and procedures. So that's a frustrating part of diplomacy, whether you're in Russia, American embassy or consulate in Russia or Brazil or Bolivia or whatever, or any country, because, they're trying to protect their native companies. We in Washington State might want to give preference to a Washington State company as opposed to a company that wants to, or from another country or from another part of the United States. Although, quite frankly, we in America welcome other companies from around the world doing business here because we know that they will employ our local people. And that provides job opportunities for our people. We need to make sure that the competition is fair so that they're not taking away jobs or will, take the equipment from a factory and then ship it off to their other country and lead to unemployment in our area. But we welcome that type of foreign investment in America. And competition, quite frankly, is good. It keeps everybody on their toes and encourages companies to perfect and improve the quality of their services or their products. Now, what happens though is, if France were to come to the United States and say, hey, you guys have a human rights problem, or you have a problem in terms of medical care, or you and let's say people in Sweden come to the United States and say, hey, you've got a real big problem on pollution, and you need to get away from coal or this or that. And we would say, thank you very much, but this is our country, and we don't need your interference and your suggestions on how we in America or the state of Washington should run our government. So when we go to China and we say, hey, you need to improve, change this policy of who can live in the cities, and the tight control over the movement of people in China, they'll say, hey, this is our system. It's worked for us for the last 500, 600 years. We are our own country. Who are you to tell us how to run our country? So I mean, that's one of the sensitivities that diplomats face all around the world. We would take great offense if Germany were to tell us, oh, you should change this approach on automobile manufacturing, or the pace of electrification of automobiles, or how to phase out combustion engines, et cetera, et cetera. We would say, hey, you go mind your own business. Well, when we try to tell the Chinese or any other country what to do on education or this or that, and they says, hey, thank you very much. We'll take it under advisement, but we are our own country.
Right, the slow grind, as it were. Okay, Ginny?
Okay. One of the audience asks, do those people who are living outside of the larger cities practice subsistence or regenerative farming? Or does China do as much as America does with monoculture and confined animal feedlots, or that kind of operation, and industrial scale food production?
They're beginning to get into industrial scale food production. And the farms in China are getting larger, but otherwise it's primarily, individual families tending to their own plots, and then, feeding their family, and then selling the excess to distributors and so forth. But they're certainly amazed at the efficiency of U.S. farming, where you can have 1,000 acres and using very high-tech machinery, from combines and tractors, and yet only having maybe 10 people, employees on the farm. They are just blown away by that. So they'd like to learn a little bit more about that, but then that also creates a problem. If you're employing less people, what happens to the people that are not employed? So in many ways, there is a tension between efficiency and modernization, but then also the human impact and the challenges to governments with respect to what do you do with the people who don't have a job.
Jeff, I think we have time for a couple more, and then we'll probably wrap up.
All right, I have at least two more, but I'm going to go with the sort of bigger picture question here in the interest of time. And this could come from anywhere, but but the question has to do with threats to China, or what's their biggest weakness? What is their biggest threat, be it internal, external, how they structure themselves, et cetera? What do you think? What have you noticed?
I think they're very concerned about, the government leaders are preoccupied with maintaining the power of the Communist Party. They're very concerned about external as well as internal threats. When I say external, not military, but societal forces. They're concerned that if something gets out of control internally, that it could unleash this wave of discontent and topple the Chinese government. So they're very concerned about these food scandals of impure food, like baby formula, tainted baby formula, adulterated medicines, pollution, poor quality housing or construction that leads to, let's say, in an earthquake, unimaginable amount of death, and it all pointing to, let's say, government corruption or incompetence. And they're afraid that all these grievances will somehow be united across the country and lead to a toppling or severe challenge to the Chinese Communist Party, which is why externally they control information that flows into China, so that Google and Facebook and Instagram and all these various social medias are not allowed because they saw how social media was used in the Arab Spring uprisings to basically bring about a change in governments and revolutions, and people communicating with each other to rise up against the governments in the Middle East. So they are so concerned about internal strife and challenges, especially social media, or even CNN news reports, that there's so much censoring. Even when people are on their equivalent of Twitter, if it's talking about Tibet, if it's talking about Uyghurs, if it's talking about human rights issues or arrests, they have thousands and thousands and thousands of censors who will delete it, stop it. Even the stories about an actress who, a very popular actress, if she, like the tennis star, I can't remember her name, her allegations of abuse by a high-ranking Chinese government official, you cannot find it in China. They stop it, censored. If there's a CNN broadcast talking about, let's say, Taiwan, suddenly CNN in China will go blank on your screen until the story is over. So there's this huge amount of control in China over what the Chinese people are able to hear or read about and receive by way of news and even internal discussion. They spend more in terms of their internal defense than they do their military. It's all about making sure that there's no challenge to the Communist Party. And even if there's a nonprofit organization that is focused on an issue that is supported or a theme of the Chinese government, they will not allow that nonprofit to get very strong, for fear that that nonprofit, non-government agency in the future might take on an issue that is antithetical to the Chinese government. So better to keep this organization from ever growing and nip it in the bud now than to allow it to grow and become popular, which then might take on an issue counter to the government and be much harder to control or shut down. So it is a very controlled society, but so many of the Chinese people are oblivious to this, and they're just focused on their daily lives, just putting food on the table, listening to their music, or buying their fashions, and just trying to make ends meet and support their families. So they really, in some ways, are not that concerned about some of this control. Now, many activists and more educated people are, and they're they bristle under this type of control. And the Chinese government, there was a question about the power of President Xi Jinping, but he is prosecuting so many of his opponents, political opponents, and even some of his former colleagues who might dare to challenge him, and he brings them up on corruption charges. You can find just about something that someone has done wrong in the past, and because of the lack of an impartial court system, that person is going to be found guilty and sentenced to many years in jail. And so that sends a message to whether it's top business people, entrepreneurs, innovators who have been very successful. You better not criticize the Chinese government. You better be very careful in what you say, because we could bring you up on some sort of charge and have you convicted. And so there's a little bit of a at least among the business class and the successful entrepreneurs, especially those who have been educated in the West or have spent some time in the West, people are not being very visible. They're really trying to keep a low profile because of the kind of the undercurrent of fear.
Right. Well, I guess the old phrase, you spend time on what's important to you, and it sounds like they're spending a lot of time and money on exactly what is most importantly to them, as you describe it. Thank you, Ginny.
Okay, I'm trying to think of how I can combine two questions into one. So I'll just talk for a second. There seems to be a trend globally of an increase in autocratic government styles. Several countries are moving that way. What do you see for the future of the world? And I want to suggest that the US should be working more with allies to protect democracy as an option for people. What thoughts do you have to close this out with?
It's of great concern to me, and it's not just around the world, but we're even seeing that here in the United States.
Yeah.
How can we be a beacon of hope and an example to the rest of the world if we don't even abide by our own elections or have faith in our elections? Where facts don't matter anymore. I really am despair over the polarization of our politics. I sometimes maybe wish that we just get rid of our party labels, quite frankly. Certainly in the state of Washington and local government, there's no Republican versus Democratic issue. I mean, so many of the issues are so completely nonpartisan. But sometimes when people take on that partisan label and they go off to Washington, D.C., or they go to Olympia, suddenly, I don't know, is it a personality change or a personality makeover? And you can't vote for the other person's idea because it came from a person of the opposing party, no matter how good the idea is, how simple, common sense it is. We got to figure out how to look beyond party. And I'm sure many of the members here are Republican, but I'm sorry, but Donald Trump did not help, in which he basically praised many of these autocrats, whether Turkey, Philippines, Russia, in which openly praised some of the tactics of some of these leaders who would, kill and arrest people who are their political opponents.
And
so I don't know how we can morally, take the high road when we have some serious reckoning on our own soil. But I hope that we do speak up, Democrats and Republicans, and say, elections are elections. I have family members who are very, very strong Republicans, very conservative Republicans, but, we need to try to say, okay, we have our political views, but we're still family. We're still Americans. We love each other. We need to come together and figure out a way in which we can find common ground on some of these issues and move forward. So I hope that America will continue to speak up on behalf of democracy and principles, universal principles of human rights, speak out against people who are dictators and autocrats, and hope that we continue to try to come together as a nation and move forward and show the rest of the world that, yeah, we can have strong political differences, very passionate differences and disagreements, but we believe in the institutions and our Constitution and our laws and regulations. And yeah, I may be upset that Al Gore did not win the president, but the Supreme Court ruled, and that is the law of the land. and we have to move forward. Because if we don't respect our courts and our legal system, then what safety valve do people have? You know what, I oftentimes lecture or give speeches to law students around the world. And I said that it's kind of like a basketball game. You have referees, and you may not agree with the decision of the referee all the time. But basically, we believe that the referees are fair and trying to do their best, and we accept the outcome of the game. Sometimes, you know, it may have actually affected the outcome of a game, but by and large, the referees are trying hard and doing their best, and we accept it. If we don't have confidence in the courts, then what's to prevent people from, like in other countries, resorting to revolution and upheaval and riots, where the military takes over the country and it's constantly back and forth, and coups are military coups are come about. So we need to understand that, yeah, I mean, in Al Gore's case, a lot of Democrats thought he won, but the Supreme Court ruled how to count the ballots. And that meant that George W. Bush won. Okay, end of debate. Let's move on. And he's now our president, and we need him to succeed, because if President Bush, George W. Bush succeeds, the country succeeds. And we have to put country first. Country first. I served with Governor Bush as a fellow Republican as a governor, and I really enjoyed Governor Bush. We would sit in the back of the room, and he was quite a jokester and just an everyday guy. And as much as I disagreed with some of his policies, he also did some good for our country. And he and I would talk on the phone once in a while when he called from the White House, and it was quite a thrill and an honor. But he's our president. He's our president. He may be a Republican, but he's the president of the United States of America, and we need our presidents to succeed. And quite frankly, if a Republican president succeeds and the country succeeds, Democrats also benefit and can benefit from it. If President Obama succeeds and the country succeeds, Republicans can also claim credit for that. So I think that we in politics need to quit being so narrow-minded and so, you know, focused on just tomorrow's election, and understand that, you know, if we do well for the state of Washington, Democrats and Republicans can all take credit and feel good about it. So anyway, I don't know if that quite answers the question, but maybe that's the way to close, because you all are focused on effective government, and effective government really focuses on what's the long-term interest of our community, whether it's our schools, whether it's the county, whether it's the city and the state. And we really need to look at long-range issues and come up with long-range solutions, and let the political chips fall where they may. But also recognize that in most cases, these issues do not have a Democrat or a Republican label, and we need to somehow work together.
I appreciate that answer, and hope that we can invite you back, maybe particularly when we can meet in person again. So I'm going to mention a couple of things, and then we'll just close away. So I'll remind you that PEG is a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. So if you're finding these events helpful, please join us as a member or make a donation to PEG. We're a nonprofit relying on membership and donations to cover our costs. Please visit our website at www.pegnow.org, and you'll find there videos from most of the forums that we have done, and you're welcome to peruse those over time. On behalf of the PEG board and membership, we wish to extend our sincere gratitude to Ambassador Locke for this important discussion. Thank you also to the audience. You're the reason that we do this work. A video of this evening's forum will be posted on our website within a couple of weeks. We're in the process of scheduling forums for early 2022, so please stay tuned and you'll hear from us soon. Thank you all for being part of the PEG forums. We send you best wishes for the holidays. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks
you, Jenny.
again.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Ambassador.
Thank you.